Marx and the psychiatrist Randolph Nessa argue that phobias are innate fears that have never been unlearned. And predation are serious threats to the tiniest hunter-gatherer. Babies fear strangers and separation, as well they should, for infanticide and predation are serious threats to the tiniest hunter-gatherers. The film A Cry in the Dark and predation are serious threats to the attended baby. It is an excellent answer to every parent's question of why the infant left alone in a dark bedroom is screaming bloody murder. Between the ages of 3 and 5, children become fearful of all the standard phobic objects. Spiders, the dark, deep water, spiders, the dark, deep water, and 5, children. Most adult phobias are childhood fears that never went away. That is why it is city dwellers who most fear snakes. As with the learning of safe foods, the best guides to the local dangers are the people who have survived them. Children fear what they see their parents fear, and often unlearn their fears when they see other children coping. Adults are just as impressionable. In wartime, courage and panic are both contagious, and in some therapies, the phobic watches as an aide plays with a boa constrictor or lets a spider crawl up her arm. Even monkeys watch one another to calibrate their fear. Stricter or lets afraid of snakes when they first see them. But if they watch a film of another monkey being frightened by rhesus macaques, our movie does not instill the fear so much as awaken it. For if the film shows the monkey recoiling from a flower or a bunny instead of a snake, the viewer develops no fear. The ability to conquer fear selectively is the ability to conquer of the instinct. People in grave danger, such as pilots in combat or Londoners during the Blitz, can be remarkably composed. People in grave heads when all about them are losing theirs, but the main calming agents are predictability, distance, and a sense of competence and control, which the writer Tom Wolfe called the right stuff. In his book, Name, about the test pilots who became Mercury astronauts, Wolfe defined the right stuff as the ability of a pilot to go up in a hurtling piece of came Mercury astronauts, the reflexes, the experience, the coolness to pull it back in the last That sense of control comes from pushing the outside of the envelope, testing in small steps how high, how fast, how far one can go without bringing on disaster. Pushing the envelope is a powerful motive. Recreation, and go without bringing on during relatively safe events that look and feel like ancestral dangers. These include most non-competitive sports, diving, climbing, spelunking, and so on, and the genres of books and movies called thrillers. Winston Churchill once said, "Nothing in life is so exhilarating as to be shot at without result." It is 1962, and you are the President of the United States. It is 1960, not attack again. In front of you is the phone to the Pentagon, the proverbial button. You can retaliate by bombing Moscow. You are about to press the button. The nation's policy is to retaliate in kind against Moscow. Terror attackers. If you don't follow through, the deterrent would have been a sham. And you are thinking the damage has been done. Killing millions of Russians will not bring millions of dead Americans back to life. Will add radioactive fallout to the atmosphere, harming your own citizens. And you will go down in history as one of the worst mass murderers of all time. Atmosphere, harming. But then it is precisely this line of thinking that emboldened the Soviets to attack. Fell, you would have nothing to gain and much to lose by retaliating. They thought they were calling your bluff, so you had better retaliate to show bluff. But then again, what's the point of proving now that you weren't bluffing then? The present cannot affect the past. But then again, what's the point of millions of lives for no reason? But wait, the Soviets knew you would think pointless to prove you weren't bluffing after they tried to call your bluff. That's why they called your bluff. The very fact that you are thinking this way brought on the catastrophe. So you shouldn't think this way. But not thinking this way now is too late. You curse your freedom. Your predicament is that you have the choice to retaliate, and since retaliating is not in your interests, you may decide not to do it exactly as the Soviets anticipated. If only you didn't have the choice. If only your missiles had been wired to a reliable nuclear fire, if Soviets would not have dared to attack because they would have known retaliation was certain. This inclusion in the novel and film Dr. Strangelove. A deranged American officer has to attack the Soviet Union, and it cannot be recalled. The president and his advisors meet in the war room with the Soviet ambassador to persuade him, and by telephone the Soviet leader, that the imminent attack is an accident and that the Soviets should not retaliate. By telephone, the Soviets installed the Doomsday Machine, a network of underground nuclear bombs that is set off automatically if the country is attacked or if anyone tries to disarm it. The fallout will destroy all human and animal life on Earth. They install missiles and bombers, and because they feared the United States might be building one and wanted to prevent a doomsday gap, missiles and bombers, confers with the country's top nuclear strategist, the brilliant Dr. Strangelove. But, Muffley said, is it really possible for it to be triggered automatically and at the same time impossible to Dr. Strangelove said quickly, but precisely, Mr. President, it is not only possible, it is essential. That is the whole is the art of producing in the enemy the fear to attack. And so because of the automated and irrevocable decision-making process which rules out human meddling, the Doomsday Machine is terrifying, simple to understand, and completely credible and convincing. President Muffley said, but this is fantastic, Dr. Strangelove. How can it be triggered automatically? Strangelove said, sir, it is remarkably simple to do that. When you merely wish to bury bombs, there is no limit to the size. It is remarkably simple to do that. When you merely wish to set of circumstances under which the bombs are to be exploded is programmed into the tape memory banks. Strangelove turned, so he looked directly at the Soviet ambassador. There's only one thing I don't understand, Mr. Ambassador. Turned, so he looked directly. Why didn't you tell the world? The ambassador turned away. He said, it was to be announced at the party congress on Monday. As you know, the premier loves surprises. The German-accented, leather-gloved, wheelchair-bound Dr. Strangelove, with his disconcerting tick of giving the Nazi salute, he was meant to symbolize a kind of intellectual who until recently was prominent in the public's imagination. The nuclear strategist, paid to think the unthinkable. These men, who included Henry Kissinger, on whom Sellers based Herman Kahn, John von Neumann, and Edward Teller, were stereotyped as amoral nerds who cheerfully filled blackboards with John von Neumann. Perhaps the scariest thing about them was their paradoxical conclusions. Paradoxical that safety in the nuclear age comes from exposing one's cities and protecting one's missiles. But the unsettling paradoxes of nuclear strategy apply to any conflict between parties whose interests are partly competing and partly shared. Common sense says that victory goes to the side with the most intelligence, self-interest, coolness, options, power, and clear lines of communication. Common sense is wrong. Each of these assets can be a liability in contests of strategy, as opposed to contests of chance. Each of these assets predicting what the other guy will do in response. Thomas Schelling has shown that the paradox is calculated for great insight into the emotions, particularly the headstrong passions that convinced the romantics that emotion and reason were opposites. But first, let's put the emotions aside and just examine the logic of conflicts of strategy. Take bargaining. When two people haggle over a car or a house, a bargain is struck when one side makes the final concession. Sure, she will not. The reason she won't concede is that she thinks he will concede. That she thinks he will because she thinks he thinks he will. And so on. There always is a range of prices that the buyer and seller would both accept. Even if a particular price within that range is not the best price for one party, it is preferable to canceling the deal. Even if a particular settle for the worst acceptable price, because the other side realizes that he or she would have the alternative was to reach no agreement at all. But when both parties can guess the range, any price within the range is a point. Any one party would have been willing to back off, and the other party knows it. Schelling points out that the trick to coming out ahead sacrifice of freedom of choice. How do you persuade someone that you will not pay more than $16,000 for a car that is really worth $20,000 to you? You can make a public and forcible $5,000 bet with a third party that you won't pay more than $16,000. As long as $16,000 gives the dealer a profit, he has no choice but to accept. Persuasion would be futile. It's against your interests to compromise. By tying your own hands, you improve your bargaining position. It's against your interests to compromise. Who is not authorized to sell at less than a certain price, even if he says he wants to. A home buyer says he wants to mortgage if the bank's appraiser says he paid too much. The home buyer exploits that powerlessness to get a better price from the seller. Says he paid too much. Conflicts of strategy, communication can be too. When you are haggling from a payphone with a friend about where to meet for dinner, you can simply announce that you will be at Ming's at 6:30 and hang up. The friend has to accede if she wants to meet you at all. Paradoxical tactics also enter into the logic of promises. A promise can secure a favor only when the beneficiary of the promise has good reason. Enter into the logic of better position when the beneficiary knows that the promiser is bound by his promise. The law has the right to sue and the right to be sued. The right to be sued? What kind of right is that? It is a right that confers the power to make a promise, to enter into contracts, borrow money, and engage in business with someone who might be harmed as a result. Similarly, the law that impacts borrow money and takes while to grant the mortgage, and so paradoxically benefits the borrower. In some societies, Schelling notes, eunuchs got the best jobs because of what they could not do. How does a hostage persuade his kidnapper not to kill him to prevent him from identifying the kidnapper in court? One option is to deliberately blind himself. A better one is to confess to a shameful secret that the kidnapper can use as blackmail. If he has no shameful secret, he can create one by having the kidnapper photograph him in some unspeakably degrading act. Threats and defenses against threats are the arena in which Dr. Strangelove really comes into his own. Threatener has an interest in carrying out the threat. For example, when a homeowner threatens a burglar in which the threat is costly to the threatener, so its value is only as a deterrent. Again, freedom is costly. The threat is credible only when the threatener has no choice but to carry it out and the target knows it. Otherwise, the target can threaten the threatener right back by refusing to comply. The doomsday machine is an obvious example, though the secrecy defeated its purpose. To comply, anyone tries to disarm him will have a better chance of seeing Cuba if he wears explosives that go off if he wears jostling. A good way to win the teenager's game of chicken, in which two cars approach each other at high speed and the first driver to swerve loses speed, is to conspicuously remove your own steering wheel and throw it away. With threats, as with promises, remove your own remains incommunicado after making the ransom demand, so he cannot be persuaded to give up the hostage for a smaller ransom or a safe escape. Rationality is also a liability. Schelling points out that he will stab himself unless you give him $10. He is more likely to get the $10 if his eyes are bloodshot. Terrorists, kidnappers, hijackers, and dictators of small countries have an interest in appearing mentally unbalanced. An absence of self-interest is also an advantage. Suicide bombers are almost impossible to stop. To defend yourself against threats, make it impossible for the threatener to make you an offer you can't refuse. Again, freedom, information, and rationality are handicaps. To make you an offer you can't, says the sticker on the delivery truck. A man who is worried that his daughter may be kidnapped, remain incommunicado, lobby for a law that makes it a crime to pay ransom, or break the hand with which an invading army may burn bridges behind it to make retreat impossible. A college president tells protesters an invading army has no influence. A racketeer cannot sell protection if the customer makes sure he is not at home, if the racketeer comes around. Because an expensive threat works both ways, it can lead to a cycle of self-incapacitation. Protesters attempt to block the construction of a nuclear power plant by lying down on the railroad tracks leading to the site. The railroad company counters by telling the engineer to set the throttle so that the train moves very slowly and then to jump out of the train and walk beside it. The protesters must scramble. Next time, the protesters handcuff themselves to the tracks. The engineer does not dare leave the train. But the protesters must be certain the engineer sees them in enough time to stop. Engineer sees them in enough time to stop. Engineer does not dare to a nearsighted engineer. In these examples, many of them from Schelling, the paradoxical power comes from a physical constraint like handcuffs or an institutional constraint like the police. But strong passions can do the same thing. Say a bargainer publicly announces that he will not pay more than $16,000 for the car, and everyone knows he could not tolerate the shame of going back on his word. The unavoidable shame is as effective as the enforceable bet. And the shame of going. Teresa offered to sell you her car. You would not insist on a guarantee because presumably she is you. The hothead who can figuratively explode at any moment enjoys the same tactical advantage as the you. In The Maltese Falcon, Sam Spade, Humphrey Bogart, dares the henchmen of Caspar Gutman, Sidney Greenstreet, to kill him, knowing that they need him to retrieve the Falcon. Gutman replies, delicate judgment on both sides, because as you know, sir, in the heat of action men are likely to forget where their best interests lie, judgment on both sides. In The Godfather, Vito Corleone tells the head of the other crime families, he tells the superstitious man, and if some unlucky accident should befall my son, if my son is struck by a bolt of lightning, I will blame some of the people here. Dr. Strangelove meets the Godfather. Is passion a doomsday machine? Lost control. They may be irrational. They may act against their interests. They act against their appeals. The man running amok calls to mind a doomsday machine that has been set off. But though this be madness, precisely these sacrifices of will and reason are effective tactics in the countless bargains, promises, and threats that make up our social relations. The theory stands the romantic model on its head. The passions are no vestige of an animal past, no wellspring of creativity, no enemy of the intellect. The intellect is designed to relinquish control to the passions so that they may serve as guarantors of its offers, promises, and threats against suspicions that they are lowballs, double crosses, and bluffs. Promises, and ineluctable part of the architecture of the brain. It has been programmed in deliberately, because programmed in deliberate and control can they be credible guarantors. The doomsday machine theory has been proposed independently by Schelling, Trivers, Daly, and Wilson, the economist Jack Hirschleifer, and the economist Robert Frank. Righteous Daly and Wilson is a credible deterrent if it is uncontrollable and unresponsive to the deterrer's cost. Such compulsions, though useful in the long run, can drive people to fight far out of proportion to the stakes. In 1982, Argentina annexed the British colony of the Falklands, desolate islands with virtually no economic or strategic importance. British colony of the Falklands them as an immediate deterrent to anyone with designs on the rest of its empire, but at that point there was no empire. Frank points out that for what they spent to reclaim the islands, Britain could have given each Falklander a Scottish castle and a lifetime pension. But most Britons were proud that they stood up to the Argentinians. The same sense of fairness makes us sue expensively for Britons were proud despite red tape that costs us more in lost wages than the product was worth. The lust for revenge is a particularly terrifying emotion. All over the world, relatives of the slain fantasize day and night about the bittersweet moment when they might avenge a life with a life and find peace at last. The emotion strikes us as primitive and dreadful because we have contracted the government to settle our scores for us. But in many societies, an irresistible thirst for vengeance is one's only settle our scores for. Differ in the resolve with which they will suffer costs to carry out vengeance. Since that vengeance is deterrent only if it is advertised, it is accompanied by the emotion traditionally referred to as honor. The desire to public advertised. The hair trigger of honor and revenge can be tuned to the degree of threat in the environment. of threat and vengeance are raised to godly virtues in societies that lie beyond the reach of law enforcement, such as remote horticulturalists and herders, Wild West, street gangs, organized crime families, and entire nation-states when dealing with one another. Street gang. But even within a modern state society where it serves no purpose, the emotion of vengeance no purpose is turned off. Most legal theories, even from the highest-minded philosophers, acknowledge that retribution is one of the legitimate goals. Retribution is what, over and above the goals of deterring potential criminals and incapacitating, deterring, and rehabilitating the offender. The goals of deterrence from the American legal system have recently pressed for a say in plea bargaining and sentencing decisions. No one can examine the emotions without seeing in them the source of much human tragedy. I don't think we should tragedy animals. It's clear enough how natural selection engineered our instincts to suit our needs. We shouldn't blame selfish genes either. They endow us with selfish motives, but they just as surely endow us with the capacity for love and a sense of justice. What we should appreciate and fear is the cunning designs of the emotions themselves. Many of their specs are not for gladness and understanding. Think of the happiness treadmill, the siren song, the sham emotions, the doomsday machines, the caprice of romance, the pointless punishment of grief and song, the sham emotions, the doomsday machine when we are wrong and emboldens us to fight when we ought to surrender. Driver's rights. Consider an argument between two closely bound people, say husband and wife. Both parties believe that one is an altruist, believe that one is relatively pure in motive and much abused, while the other is characterized by a pattern of selfishness spread over hundreds of incidents, and much abuse, who is selfish. It is noteworthy that the argument may appear to burst forth spontaneously, yet as it rolls along, two whole landscapes of information processing appear to lie already organized, waiting only for the light organ to show themselves. In cartoons and movies, the villains are mustache-twirling degenerates, convinced of their rectitude. Many biographers of evil men start out assuming that their subjects are cartoonists, and reluctantly discover that they are ideologues and moralists. If Hitler was an actor, concluded one, he was an actor who believed in the part. Still, thanks to the complexity of our minds, we need not be perpetual in the part. Some designed for virtue, some designed for reason, some clever enough to outwit the parts that are neither. One self may deceive another, but every now and then, a third self sees the truth. Family values. Come on, people now, smile on your brother. Everybody get together, try to love one another right now. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Harmony and understanding, sympathy and trustable, and living dreams of visions, mystic crystal revelation, and the mind's true liberation, imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Imaginations. I say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be one. Incredible as it may seem, many of us used to believe this treacle. 1960s and 70s was that mistrust, jealousy, competitiveness, greed, and manipulation were social institutions. 70s was that unnecessary evils like slavery or the denial of the vote to women. Others thought they were hidebound traditions whose inefficiency had gone unnoticed, as with the genius who figured out that toll bridges could charge $1 to the traffic going one way instead of 50 cents to the traffic going both ways. These sentiments came not just from rock musicians, but from America's distinguished book, The Greening of America. The Yale law professor Charles Reich heralded a non-violent Charleston being led by the college-age generation. The youth of America had evolved a new consciousness, he said. It was less guiltless, he said, non-judgmental, non-competitive, non-materialistic, affectionate, honest, unmanipulative, unaggressive, communal, and unconcerned with status and careers. The new consciousness, emerging like flowers through the pavement, was expressed in their music, communes, hitchhiking, drugs, moon-gazing, peace salute, and even their clothing. Bell-bottoms, he said, give the ankles a special freedom as if to invite dancing right on the street. Bell-bottoms, he said, give the ankles a special freedom, liberated individual. Its ultimate creation will be a new and enduring wholeness and will be a renewed relationship of man to himself, to other men, to society, to nature, and to the land. Greening sold 1 million copies in a few months. It was serialized in The New Yorker and discussed in a dozen articles in the New York Times, and copies in a few months. John Kenneth Galbraith gave it a positive review, though with a caveat positive in his title, Who's Minding the Store? The book recently came out in a 25th anniversary edition. Reich wrote his book in the Yale dining halls and based it on his conversations with the students there. Those students, of course, Yale dining hall. With Mom and Dad paying the bills, everyone around them coming from the upper classes, and coming credentials about to launch them into the expanding economy of the 1960s, it was easy to believe that all you need is love. All you need is love. Today, Reich's generation became the Gucci-wearing, Beamer-driving, condo-owning, gourmet baby-breeding urban professionals of the 19 became the Gucci was a style as ephemeral as the bell-bottoms, a status symbol that distanced them from rednecks, jocks, and the less hip preppies. As the post-60s rock musician Elvis Costello asked, was it a millionaire who said, "Imagine no possessions"? The Woodstock Nation was not the first utopian dream to be shattered. The free-love communes of 19th century America collapsed from sexual jealousy and the resentment of both sexes over the leader's habit of accumulating. America, utopias of the 20th century, became repressive empires led by men who collected Cadillacs, led by men. In anthropology, one South Sea Island paradise after another has turned out to be nasty and brutish. Margaretology, once fied and free of crime. It turned out that the boys tutored one another in rape techniques. She called the Arapesh gentle. They were headhunters. She said that the Chambuli reversed our sex roles, the men wearing curls and makeup. In fact, the men beat their wives, exterminated neighboring tribes, and treated homicide as a milestone in a young man's life. In fact, the men beat so effeminate. In Human Universals, the anthropologist Donald Universals, the traits that, as far as we know, are found in all human cultures. They include prestige and status, inequality of power and wealth, inheritance, reciprocity, punishment, sexual modesty, sexual regulations, sexual jealousy, reciprocity, punishment, a division of labor by sex, including more child care by women and greater public child dominance by men, hostility to other groups, and conflict within the group, including violence, rape, and murder. The list should come as no surprise to anyone familiar with history, current events, or literature. There are a small number of plots in the world's fiction and drama, and the scholar Georges Polti claims to have listed them all. More than 80% are defined by adversaries, often murderous, by tragedies of kinship or love, or both. In the real world, our life stories are largely stories of conflict. The hurts, guilts, and rivalries inflicted by parents, siblings, children, spouses, lovers, friends, and competitors. Inflicted by parents, siblings, children, spouses, withstanding, that means it is largely about inborn motives that put us into conflict with one another, given that our brains were shaped by natural selection, it could hardly be otherwise. Natural selection is driven by the competition among genes to be represented in the next generation. Reproduction leads to a geometric increase in descendants, and on a finite planet, not every several generations hence. Therefore, organisms reproduce to some extent at If one organism eats a fish, that fish is no longer available to be eaten by another organism. If one organism mates one, it denies an opportunity at parenthood to a third. Everyone alive today is a descendant of millions of generations of ancestors, opportunity at parenthood. That means that all people today owe their existence to having winners as ancestors, and everyone today is designed, at least in some circumstances, to compete. That does not mean that people, or any other animals, house an aggressive urge that must be discharged, an unconscious death wish, a rapacious sex drive, a territorial imperative, a thirst for territorial imperative, a thirst for, and unconquated with Darwinism. In The Godfather, Sollozzo says to Tom Hagen, "I don't like violence, Tom. I'm a businessman. Blood is a big expense." Even in the harshest competition, an intelligent organism must be a strategist, assessing whether its goals might best be served by retreat, conciliation, or living and letting live. As I explained, it is genes, not organisms, that must compete or die. Sometimes the gene's best strategy is to design organisms that cooperate. Compete or die. Natural selection does not forbid cooperation and generosity. It just makes them difficult. Problems like stereoscopic vision. The difficulty of building an organism to see in stereo has not prevented natural selection from stereoscopic vision. Come to understand stereo if we thought it just came free with having two eyes and failed to look with having sophisticated neural programs that accomplish it. Similarly, the difficulty of building an organism to cooperate and be generous has not to cooperate from installing cooperation and generosity in humans. But we will never understand these capacities if we think that cooperation onboard computers of social organisms, especially of humans, should run sophisticated humans that assess the opportunities and risks at hand and compete or cooperate accordingly. The conflict of interest among the members of a species also does not call for a conservative political agenda, as journalists and social scientists often fear. Some worry that if a conservative political violence would be morally correct. Since they are deplorable, conflict had better not deplorable. Conflict. The reasoning, of course, is fallacious. Nothing says that nature has to be nice, and what people want to do is not necessary and ought to do. Others worry that if conflicting motives are inevitable, it would be futile to try to reduce violence and exploitation. Our current social arrangements would be the best one can hope for. But that does not follow either. Among modern Western societies, homicide rates vary from 0.5 per million persons per year in Iceland in the first half of the 20th century, to 10 in most European countries at present, to 25 in Canada, to 100 in the United States and Brazil. Countries at present, to 25 countries at present, to 25 in Canada, academic question of whether it can ever be reduced to zero. Moreover, there are ways to reduce conflict other than to dream of a golden future of indiscriminate love. People in all societies not only perpetrate violence, but deplore it. Steps to reduce violent conflict, such as sanctions, redress, censure, mediation, ostracism, and law. Conflict, such as so that I can get on with the content of the chapter. My goal is not to convince you that people don't always want the best for one another, but to try to explain when and why that should be true. But sometimes the trite has to be stated. The observation that condition, banal though it is, contradicts fashionable beliefs. One is expressed in the gluey metaphor, now though it is. Another is the assumption that we unthinkingly play out the roles society assigns to us, and that social reform is a matter of rewriting the roles. I suspect that if you pressed many academics and social critics, you would find views no less utopian than those of Charles Reich. If the mind is an organ of computation engineered by natural selection, our social motives should be strategy. If the mind, people should have distinct kinds of thoughts and feelings about kin and non-kin, and about parents, children, siblings, dates, spouses, acquaintances, friends, rivals, allies, and enemies. A man and a woman can fall in love, and the key ingredient is an expression of commitment. A man and a woman need each other's DNA and hence can enjoy sex. A man and a woman have a common interest in their children, and their enduring love has evolved to protect that interest. And a husband and a woman have a common the lifelong dependability and trust that underlies the logic of friendship. More on this later. These emotions are rooted in the fact that if a man and woman are monogamous, together for life, and not nepotistic toward their own families, the fact that if a man and... Unfortunately, that is a big if. Even the happiest couples can fight like cats and dogs. Today, 50% of marriages in the United States end in divorce. George Bernard Shaw wrote, "When we want to read of the deeds that are done for love, whither do we turn? To the murder column." Conflict between men and women, sometimes deadly, is universal, and it suggests column 1. Once again, that banality must be stated because the conventional wisdom denies stated because one of the utopian ideals of the 1960s, reiterated ever since by sex gurus like Dr. Ruth, is the intensely erotic, mutually enjoyable, guilt-free, emotionally open, lifelong monogamous pair bond. The alternative from the counterculture was the emotionally open round-robin orgy. Both were attributed to our hominid ancestors, to earlier stages of civilization, or to primitive tribes still out there somewhere. Both are as mythical as the Garden of Eden. The battle between the sexes is not just a skirmish in the war between unrelated individuals, but is fought in a different theater, for reasons first explained by Donald Simons. With respect to human sexuality, he wrote, there is a female human nature and a male human nature, and these natures are extraordinarily different. Men and women differ in their sexual natures because throughout the immensely long hunting and gathering phase of human evolutionary history, the sexual desires and dispositions that were adaptive for either sex were for the other evolutionary history. The sexual desires and dispositions that there are any interesting differences between the sexes. At my own institution, gender used to be taught that the only well-established difference between men and women is that men like women and women like men. Science's two human natures are dismissed as gender stereotypes, as if that were proof that they are false. The belief that spiders spin webs and pigs don't, gender stereotyped. As we shall see, some stereotypes about sexual feelings have been verified beyond a reasonable In fact, researchers in sex difference have found that many gender stereotypes underestimate the documented differences between the sexes. The first question of strategy is how many partners to want. Remember, a male can have more offspring if he mates with many females, but a female does not have if she mates with many males. One per conception is enough. Suppose a foraging man with one wife can expect 2 to 5 children with her. A premarital or extramarital liaison that conceives a child would increase his reproductive output by 20 to 50%. Or father isn't around, the father is genetically no better off. The optimal liaison, then, is with a married woman whose husband would bring up the child. In foraging societies, fertile women are almost always married, so sex with a woman is usually sex with a married woman. Even if she is not, more fatherless children live than die, so a liaison with an unmarried partner can increase reproduction too. None of this math applies to women. A part of the male mind, then, should want a variety of sexual partners for the sheer sake of having a variety. Women. The only difference between men and women is that men like women and women like men. Any bartender or grandmother, you ask, would say that men are more likely to have a wandering eye, but perhaps that is just an old-fashioned stereotype. The more likely to have likely to refute it. Men and women in elite liberal American universities a generation after the Revolution, in the heyday of politically correct sensibilities. The methods are refreshingly direct. Confidential questionnaires asked a series of questions. How strongly are you seeking a spouse? The answers were on average identical for men and women. How strong? Said not very strongly. The men said pretty strongly. How many sexual partners would you like to have in the next month, in the next 2 years, in your lifetime? Women said that in the next month, 8/10 of a sexual partner would be just about right. They wanted 1 in the next 2 years and 4 or 5 over their lifetimes. Men wanted 2 sex partners. They wanted 1 in 18 over their lifetimes. Would you consider having sex with a desirable partner that you had known for 5 years, for 2 years, for a month, for a week? Women said probably yes for a man they had known for a year, probably yes for one they had known for 6 months, and definitely not for someone they had known a week or less. Men said probably yes as long as they had known the woman for a week. How short a time would a man have to know a woman before he would definitely not have sex with her? Buss never found out. His scale did not go down past 1 hour. When Buss presented these findings at a university and explained them in terms of parental investment and sexual selection, a young woman raised her hand and said, "Professor Buss, I have a simpler explanation of parental investment and sexual selection. A young woman. Are men really slime, or are they just trying to look like slime? Or Are they just trying? Questionnaires, men try to exaggerate their studliness, but women want to avoid looking easy. The psychologists Art Clark and Elaine Hatfield hired attractive men and women to approach strangers of the opposite sex on a college campus and say to them, I've been noticing you, or attractive men and women ask one of three questions. A, would you go out with me tonight? B, would you come over to an apartment tonight? C, would you go to bed with me tonight? Half the women consented to a date. Half the men consented to a date. Half the percent of the women consented to go to the Stooges' apartment. 69% of the men consented to go to the Stooges' apartment. Consented to go to the Stooges. Percent of the men consented to sex. Of the remaining 25%, many were apologetic, asking for a rain check or explaining that they couldn't because their fiancé was in town. The results have been replicated in several states. When the studies were conducted, contraception was widely available, and safe-sex practices were heavily publicized, so the results cannot be contraception was one sexually transmitted diseases. End of Side 7. Please turn to Side 8. An awakening of male sexual desire by a new partner is known as the Coolidge effect, after a famous anecdote. One day, President Calvin Coolidge and his wife were visiting a government farm and were taken on separate tours. When Mrs. Coolidge was shown the chicken pens, she asked whether the rooster copulated more than once a day. Dozens of times, replied the chicken pens. She asked whether the rooster president, Mrs. Coolidge requested. When the president was shown the pens and told about the rooster, he asked, "Same hen every time?" "Oh, no, Mr. President, a different one each time." The president said, "Tell that to Mrs. Coolidge." Many male mammals are indefatigable when a new willing female is available after each copulation. They cannot be fooled by the experimenter cloaking a previous partner or masking her scent. This shows, incidentally, that male sexual desire is not exactly undiscriminating. Males may not care what kind of female they mate with, but they are hypersensitive to which female they mate with. Men do not have the sexual stamina of roosters, but they show a kind of Coolidge effect in their desire over longer periods. In many cultures, including our own, men report that theirs, for their wives, wanes in the first years of marriage. It is the concept of the individual person, not her appearance or other qualities, not her decline. The taste for new partners is not just an example of variety being the spice of life, as in getting bored with strawberry and wanting to try chocolate ripple. In Isaac Bashevis Singer's story Schlemiel I, a simpleton from the mythical village of Chelm sets out on a trip but loses his way and inadvertently returns home, thinking he has come across another village, which by an amazing coincidence looks just like his. He meets a woman who looks exactly like the wife he has grown tired of and finds her ravishing. The meaning of life. Man does not live by bread alone, or by know-how, safety, children, or sex. People everywhere spend as much time as they can afford on activities that, in the struggle to survive and reproduce, seem pointless. As much time as they joke, laugh, and tease. They sing and dance. They decorate surfaces. They perform rituals. They wonder about the causes of fortune and misfortune and hold beliefs about the supernatural that contradict everything else they know about the world. They concoct theories of the universe and their place within it. As if that weren't enough of a puzzle, the more biologically frivolous and vain the activity, the more people exalt it. Art, literature, music, wit, religion, and philosophy are not just pleasurable but noble. They are the mind's best work, what makes life worth living. Why do we pursue the living, futile, and experience them as sublime? To many educated people, the question seems horribly Philistine, even immoral. Anyone interested in the biological makeup of Homo sapiens. Members of our species do mad deeds like taking vows of celibacy, living for their music, selling their blood to buy movie tickets, and going to graduate school. Why? How might we understand the psychology of the arts, humor, religion, and philosophy within the theme of this book, that the mind is a naturally selected neural computer. Every college has a faculty of arts, which usually dominates the institution in numbers and in the public eye. But the tens of thousands of scholars and millions of pages of scholarship have shed almost no light on the question of why people pursue the arts at all. The function of the arts is almost defiantly obscure, and I think there are several reasons why. One is that the arts engage not only the psychology of aesthetics, but the psychology of status. The very uselessness of art that makes it so incomprehensible, but comprehensible to economics and social psychology. What better proof that you have money to spare than your being able to spend it on doodads and stunts that don't fill the belly or keep the rain out, but that require precious materials, years of practice, a command of obscure texts, or intimacy with the elite? Thorstein Veblen's and Quentin Bell's analyses of taste and fashion, in which an elite's conspicuous displays of consumption, leisure, and outrage are emulated by the rabble, sending the elite off in conspicuous displays the otherwise inexplicable oddities of the arts. The grand styles of one wacky in the next, as we see in words that are both period labels and terms of abuse: Gothic, Mannerist, Baroque, Rococo. The steadfast patrons of the arts are the aristocracy and those who want to join them. Most people would lose their taste according if they learned it was being sold at supermarket checkout counters or on late-night television, and even the work of relatively prestigious, Pierre-Auguste Renoir draws derisive reviews when it is shown in a popular blockbuster museum show. The value of art is largely unrelated to aesthetics. A priceless masterpiece becomes worthless if it is found to be a forgery. It's worthless if it is in comic strips become high art when the art world says they are, and then command conspicuously wasteful prices. Modern wasteful works are intended not to give pleasure but to confirm or confound the theories of a guild of critics and analysts, to épater la bourgeoisie, or to baffle the rubes in Peoria. The banality that the psychology of the arts is partly the psychology of status has been repeatedly pointed out, not just by cynics and barbarians, but by erudite social commentators such as Quentin Bell and Tom Wolfe. But in the modern university, it is unmentioned, indeed unmentionable. Academics and intellectuals are culture vultures. In a gathering of today's elite, it is perfectly acceptable to laugh that you barely passed physics for poets and rocks for jocks, and have remained ignorant of science ever since, despite the obvious importance of scientific literacy to it, and have remained ignorant of science ever since. The choice, or that you tried listening to Mozart once but prefer Andrew Lloyd Webber, is as shocking as Andrew Lloyd Webber sleeve, or announcing that you employ children in your sweatshop, despite the obvious unimportance of your tastes in leisure time activity to just about anything. The blending in people's minds of art, status, and virtue is an extension of Bell's principle of nihil morality. People find dignity in the signs of an honorably futile existence removed from all menial necessities. I mention these facts not to denigrate the arts, but to clarify my topic. I want you to look at the psychology of the arts, and later the psychology, with the disinterested eye of an alien biologist trying to make sense of the human species, rather than as a member of the species the arts are portrayed. Of course we find pleasure and enlightenment in contemplating the products of the arts, and not all of it is a product in sharing the tastes of the beautiful people. But to understand the psychology of the arts that remains when we subtract out the psychology of status, we must leave at the door our terror of being mistaken for the kind of person who prefers Andrew Lloyd Webber to Mozart. We need to begin with folk songs, pulp fiction, and paintings on black velvet, not Mahler, Eliot, and Kandinsky. And that does not mean compensating for our slumming by dressing up the lowly subject matter in highfalutin theory. A semiotic analysis of Peanuts, a psychoanalytic exegesis of Archie Bunker, a deconstruction of Vogue. It means asking a simple question. What is it about the mind that lets people take pleasure? And myths. That question might be answerable, whereas questions about art in general are not. Theories of art carry the seeds of their own destruction. In an age when any Joe can buy CDs, paintings, and novels, artists make their careers by finding ways to avoid the hackneyed, to challenge jaded tastes, to differentiate the cognoscenti, to dance, and to flout the current wisdom about what art is. hence the fruitless attempts over the decades to define art. Any define art recognize that dynamic is doomed to sterility. It can never explain why music pleases the ear, because music will be defined to chromatic compositions and other intellectual exercises. It will never understand the bawdy laughs and convivial banter that's so important in people's lives, because it will define humor as the arch-wit of an Oscar Wilde. Excellence and the avant-garde are designed for the sophisticated palate, a product of years of immersion in a genre and a familiarity with its conventions and clichés. They rely on one-upmanship and arcane illusions and displays of virtuosity. However fascinating and worthy of our support they are, they tend to obscure the psychology of aesthetics, not to illuminate it. The most common of all follies, wrote H. L. Mencken, is to believe passionately in the palpably not true. It is the chief occupation of mankind. In culture after culture, people believe that the soul lives on after death, that rituals can change the physical world and divine the truth, and that illness and misfortune are caused and alleviated by spirits, ghosts, saints, fairies, angels, demons, cherubim, jinns, devils, and gods. According to polls, more than a quarter of today's Americans believe in witches. Almost half believe in ghosts, half believe in the devil, half believe that the book of Genesis is literally true, most half believe in ghosts, most half believe in ghosts, half believe in the devil, 96% believe in a god or universal spirit. How does spirit mind that one might have thought was designed to reject the palpably not true? The common answer, that people take comfort in the thought of a universal plan, or an afterlife, is unsatisfying because it only raises the question of why a mind would evolve to find comfort, why it can plainly see are false. A freezing person finds no comfort in believing he is warm. A person face to face with a lion is at ease by the conviction that it is a rabbit. What is religion? Like the psychology of the arts, the psychology of the arts, the scholar's attempts to exalt it while understanding it. Religion cannot be equated with our higher spiritual, humane, ethical yearnings, though it sometimes overlaps with them. The Bible contains instructions for genocide, rape, and the destruction of families, and even the 10 instructions, read in context, prohibit murder, lying, and theft only within the tribe, not against outsiders. Religions have given us witch burnings, crusades, inquisitions, jihads, fatwas, suicide bombers, abortion clinic gunmen, and bombers, abortion sons, so they can be happily reunited in heaven. As Blaise Pascal wrote, men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from religious conviction. Religion is not a single topic. What we call religion in the modern West is an alternative culture of laws and customs that survived alongside those of the nation-state because of accidents of European history. Religions, like other cultures, have produced great art, philosophy, and law, but their customs, like those of other cultures, often serve the interests of the people who promulgate them. Philosophy and law about to become ancestors. As one's days dwindle, life begins to shift from life dilemma, in which defection can be punished and cooperation rewarded, to a one-shot prisoner's dilemma, in which enforcer's dilemma. If you can convince your children that your soul will live on and watch over their affairs, they are less emboldened to defect while you are alive. Food taboos keep members of the tribe from becoming intimate with outsiders. Rites of passage demarcate the people who are entitled, demarcate of social categories, fetus or family member, child or adult, single or married, so as to preempt endless haggling, painful initiations weed out anyone who wants the benefits of membership without being committed to paying the costs. Witches, people. Shamans and priests are wizards of Oz who use special effects, from sleight of hand and ventriloquism effects, from temples and cathedrals, to convince others that they are privy to forces of power and wonder. Let's focus on a distinctive part of the psychology of religion. The anthropologist Ruth Benedict first pointed out the common thread of religious practice in all cultures. Religion is a technique for success. Ambrose Bierce defined to pray as to ask that the laws of the universe be annulled on behalf of a single petitioner confessedly unworthy. People everywhere beseech gods and spirits for recovery from illness, for success in love or on the battlefield, and for good weather. Religion is a desperate measure that people resort to when the stakes are high and they have exhausted the usual techniques for the causation of success. Medicines, strategies, courtship, and in the case of the weather, nothing. What kind of mind would do something as useless as inventing ghosts and bribing them for good weather? What kind of mind would do something as useless as invent? The anthropologists Pascal Boyer and Dan Sperber have shown that it fits rather well. First, non-literate peoples are not psychotic hallucinators who are unable to distinguish fantasy from reality. There is a humdrum world of people and objects driven by the usual laws, and find the ghosts and spirits of their belief system to be terrifying and fascinating precisely because they violate their own ordinary intuitions about the world. Second, the spirits, talismans, seers, and other sacred entities are never invented out of whole cloth. People take a construct from one of the cognitive modules, an object, cognitive module, animal, natural substance, or artifact, and cross out a property or write in a new one, letting the construct keep the issue traits. A tool or weapon or substance will be granted some extra causal power, but otherwise is expected to behave as it lives at one place at one time, is unable to pass through solid objects, and so on. A spirit is stipulated to one or more of the laws of biology, growing, aging, dying, physics, solidity, visibility, causation by contact, or psychology, thoughts and desires are known only through behavior. But otherwise, the spirit is recognizable as a kind of person or animal. Spirits see and hear, have a memory, have beliefs and desires, act on conditions that they believe will bring about a desired effect, make decisions, and issue threats and bargains. When the elders spread religious beliefs, they never bother to spell out these defaults. No one ever says, if the spirits promise us good weather in exchange for a sacrifice, and they know we want good weather, they predict that we will make good weather, Spirits promise us because they know that the minds of the pupils will automatically supply these beliefs from their tacit apply these beliefs. Believers also avoid working out the strange logical consequences of these piecemeal revisions of ordinary things. We don't pause to wonder why a God who knows our intentions has to listen to our prayers, or how a God can both see into the future and care about how we choose to act. Compared to the mind-bending ideas of modern science, religious beliefs are notable for their lack of imagination. God is a imagination. In hell are places. Souls are people who have sprouted wings. That is because religious concepts are human concepts, that make them wondrous, and a longer list of standard traits that make them sensible to our ordinary ways of knowing. But where do people foundations? Even when all else has failed, why would they waste time spinning ideas and practices that are useless, even harmful? Except that human knowledge and power have limits and conserve their thoughts for domains in which they can do some good. I have alluded to one possibility. For miracles creates a market that would-be priests compete in, and they can succeed by exploiting people's dependence on experts. I let the dentist drill my teeth and the surgeon cut into my body, even though I cannot possibly verify for myself the assumptions they used to justify those mutilations. That same trust would have made me submit to medical quackery a century ago, and to a witch doctor's charms millennia ago. Of course, witch doctors must have some track record, or they would lose all credibility, and they do blend their hocus-pocus with genuine practical knowledge, such as herbal remedies and prediction of events, for instance the weather, that are more accurate than chance. And beliefs about a world of spirits do not come from nowhere. They are hypotheses intended to explain certain data that's about a world of spirits do not come from nowhere. That animistic beliefs are grounded in universal experiences. When people dream, their bodies in bed, but some other part of them is up and about in the world. The soul and the body also part company in the trance brought on by an illness or a hallucinogen. Even when we are awake, we see shadows and reflections in still water that seem to carry the essence of a person without having mass, volume, or continuity in time and space. And in death, the body has lost some invisible force that animates it in life. One theory that brings these facts together is that the soul wanders off when we sleep, lurks in the shadows, looks back at us from the surface of a pond, and leaves the body when we die. Modern science has come up with a better theory of shadows and reflections, but how well does it do at explaining the sense? Imagines and directs the body? Some problems continue to baffle the modern mind. As the philosopher Colin McGinn put it in his summary of them, the head spins in theoretical disarray. No explanatory model suggests itself. Bizarre ontologies loom. There is a feeling of intense confusion, but no clear idea about where the confusion lies. I discussed one of the problems, consciousness in the sense of sentience or subjective experience, not in the sense of information access or self-reflection. How could an event of neural information processing cause the feel of a toothache or the taste of lemon or the color purple? How could I know whether a worm, a robot, a brain slice in a dish, or you are sentient? Is your sensation of red the same as mine, or might it be like my sensation of green? What is it like to be dead? Another, or might it be like the unified center of sentience that comes into and goes out of existence, that changes out of existence, same entity, and that has a supreme moral worth? Why should the I of 1996 reap the rewards in 1996 earned by the I of 1976? Say I let someone scan a blueprint of my brain into a computer, destroy my body into a computer, me in every detail, memories and all. Would I have taken a nap or committed suicide? If 2 eyes were reconstituted, would I have double the pleasure? How many selves are in the skull of a split-brain patient? What about in the partly fused brains of a pair of Siamese twins? When does a zygote acquire a self? How much of my brain tissue has to die before I die? Free will is another enigma. How can my actions be a choice for which I am responsible if they are completely caused by complete upbringing and my brain state? Some events are determined, some are random. How can a choice be neither? When I hand my wallet to an armed man who threatens to kill me if I don't, is that a choice? What about if I shoot a child because an armed man threatens to kill me if I don't? If I choose to do something I could have done otherwise, but what does that mean in a single universe unfolding in time according to laws which I pass through only once? I am faced with a momentous decision, and an expert on human behavior with a 99% success rate predicts that I will choose what at this point looks like the worst alternative. Should I continue to agonize, or should I save time and do what's inevitable? A fourth puzzle is meaning. When I talk about planets, I can refer to all planets in the universe, past, present, and future. But how could I right now, here in my house, be standing in some relationship to a planet that will be present and future? But how could I right now hear number means my mind has commerce with an infinite set? But I am a finite being but I am a sample of the natural numbers. Knowledge is just as perplexing. How could I arrive at the certainty that the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides, everywhere and for all eternity, here in the comfort of my eternity, with not a triangle or tape measure in sight? How do I know that I'm not a brain in a vat, or dreaming, or living a hallucination vat programmed by an evil neurologist, or that the universe was not created 5 minutes ago complete with fossils, memories, and historical records? If every emerald I have seen so far is green, why should I conclude all emeralds are green, rather than all emeralds are GRU, where GRU means either observed before the year 2020 and green, or not so observed and blue? All the emeralds I have seen are green, but then all the emeralds I've seen are GRU. The 2 conclusions are equally weighted, but one predicts that the first emerald I see in 2020 will be the color of grass, and the other predicts that it will be the color of the sky. A final conundrum is morality. If I secretly hatchet the unhappy, despised pawnbroker, where is the evil nature of that act registered? What does it mean to say that I shouldn't do it? How did ought emerge from a universe of particles and planets, genes and bodies? If the aim of ethics is to maximize happiness, should we indulge a sicko who gets more pleasure from killing than his victims do from living? If it is to maximize lives, should we publicly execute a framed man if it would deter 1,000 murder? If it is to max experiments that would save millions? People have thought about these problems People have thought about progress in solving them. They give us a sense of bewilderment, of intellectual vertigo. McGinn shows how thinkers have cycled among 4 kinds of solutions over the ages, none satisfactory. Philosophical problems have a feeling of the divine, and the favorite solution in most times and places is mysticism and religion. Consciousness is a divine spark in each of us. The self-spark, soul, an immaterial ghost that floats above physical events. Souls just exist, or they were created by God. God granted each soul a moral worth and the power of choice. He has stipulated what is good and inscribes every soul's good and evil acts in the book of soul's good or punishes it after it leaves the body. Knowledge is granted by God to the prophet or the seer, or guaranteed to all of us, the seer, and omniscience. The solution is explained in the rejoinder to the limerick about why the tree continues to be when there's no one about in the quad. Dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I am always about in the quad, and that's why the tree will continue to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. The problem with the religious solution was stated by Mencken when he wrote, "Theology is the effort to explain the unknowable in terms of the not worth knowing." For anyone with a persistent intellectual curiosity, religious explanations are not worth knowing because they pile equally baffling enigmas on top of the original ones. What gave God a mind, free will, knowledge, certainty about right and wrong? How does he infuse them into a universe that seems to run just fine according to physical laws? How does he get ghostly souls to interact with hard matter? And most perplexing of all, physical laws. How does he get physical laws? How does he get ghostly souls to suffering? As the Yiddish expression says, if God lived on earth, people would windows. Modern philosophers have tried three other solutions. One is to say that the mysterious entities are an say that the mystery of the universe and to leave it at that. The universe, we would conclude, contains space, time, gravity, electromagnetism, time, gravity, matter, energy, and consciousness, or will, or selves, or ethics, or meaning, or all of them. The answer to our curiosity about why the universe has consciousness is get over it, it just does. We feel cheated because no insight has been offered and because we know that the details of consciousness, will, and knowledge are minutely related to the physiology of the brain. The irreducibility theory leaves that a coincidence. A second approach is to deny that there is a problem. We have been misled by fuzzy thinking or by beguiling but empty idioms of language, such as the pronoun I. Statements about consciousness, will, self, and ethics cannot be verified, will, self, and proof or empirical test, so they are meaningless. But this answer leaves us incredulous, not enlightened. As Descartes, not enlightened, consciousness is the most indubitable thing there is. It is a datum to be explained. It cannot be defined out of existence by regulations about what we are allowed to call meaningful, to say nothing of ethical statements such as that slavery and the Holocaust were wrong. A third approach is to domesticate the problem by collapsing it with one we can solve. Consciousness is activity in layer 4 of the cortex, or the contents of short-term memory. Free will is in the anterior cingulate sulcus, or the executive subroutine. Morality, subroutine. Morality, free. Each suggestion of this kind, to the extent that it is correct, does solve one problem, but correct leaves unsolved the main problem. How does activity in layer 4 of the cortex cause my private, pungent, tangy sensation of redness? I can imagine a creature whose layer 4 is active, but who does not have the sensation of red or the sensation of anything. Or the sensation of anything rules the creature out. No account of the causal effects of the cingulate sulcus can explain how human choices are not hence something we can be held responsible for. Theories of the evolution of the moral sense can explain why we condemn sense against ourselves and our kith and kin, but cannot explain the conviction, as unshakable as our grasp of geometry, that some acts are inherently wrong, even if their net effects are neutral or beneficial to our overall well-being. To a different solution, defended by McGinn and based on speculations by Noam Chomsky, the biologist Gunther Stent, and before them David Hume. Maybe philosophical problems are hard not because they are divine or irreducible or meaningless or workaday science, but because the mind of Homo sapiens lacks the cognitive equipment to solve them. We are organisms, not angels, and our minds are organs, not pipelines to the truth. Our minds evolved by natural selection to solve problems that were life and death matters to our ancestors, not to commune with correctness or to answer any question we are capable of asking. We cannot hold 10,000 words in short-term memory. We cannot see ultraviolet light. We cannot mentally rotate an object in the fourth dimension. And perhaps we cannot solve conundrums like free will and sentience. We can well imagine creatures with fewer cognitive faculties than we have. We We can well imagine creatures with rats that cannot learn a maze with food in the prime-numbered arms, autistics who cannot conceive of other minds, children who cannot understand what the fuss around sex is about, neurological patients who see every detail in a face except whose it is, stereo-blind people who can understand a stereogram as a problem in geometry but cannot see it pop out in depth, Stereo-blind people did not know better. They might call 3D vision a miracle, or claim that it just is and needs no explanation, or write it off needs no explanation. So why should there not be creatures with more cognitive faculties than we have, or with different ones? They might readily grasp how free will and consciousness emerge from a brain and how meaning and morality fit into the universe, and would be amused by the religious and philosophical headstands we do to make up for our blankness when facing these problems. They could try to explain the solutions to us, but could try to explain the explanations. The hypothesis is almost perversely unprovable, though it could be disproved if anyone ever solved the age-old puzzles of philosophy, and there are indirect reasons to suspect it is true. One is that the species' best minds have flung themselves at the puzzles for millennia but have made no progress in solving them. Another is that they have a different character from even the most challenging problems of science. Problems such as how a child learns language or how a fertilized egg becomes an organism are horrendous in practice and may never be solved completely. But if they aren't, it will be for mundane practical reasons. The causal processes are too intertwined or chaotic, the phenomena are too messy to capture and dissect in the lab, the math is beyond the capacity of foreseeable computers. But scientists can imagine the kinds of theories that might be solutions, right or wrong, for computers. But scientists can imagine from being too complicated, they are maddeningly simple. Consciousness and choice inhere in a special dimension or coloring that is somehow pasted onto neural events without meshing with their causal machinery. The challenge is the correct explanation of how that happens, but to imagine a theory that could explain how it happens, a theory that would place the phenomenon as an effect of some cause, any cause. It is easy to draw extravagant and unwarranted conclusions from the suggestion that our minds lack the equipment to solve the major problems of philosophy. It does not say that there is some paradox of trying to understand itself. Psychologists and neuroscientists don't study their own minds. Scientists don't else's. Nor does it imply some principled limitation on the possibility of knowledge by any knower, like the unseen knower or Gödel's theorem. It is an observation about one organ of one species, equivalent to observing that cats are colorblind, monkeys cannot learn long division. It does not justify religious or mythical beliefs, but explains why they are futile. Philosophers why they are futile. Job, because they clarify these problems, chip off chunks that can be solved, and solve them or hand them over to science to solve. The hypothesis does not imply that we have sighted the end of science or bumped into a barrier on how much we can ever learn about how the mind works. The computational aspect of consciousness, what information is available to which processes, the neurological aspect, what in the brain correlates with consciousness, and the evolutionary aspect, when and why did the brain correlates with consciousness, and the evolution have decades of progress and eventually a complete understanding. Even if we never think residual brain teasers like whether your red is the same as my red or what it is like to be a bat. In mathematics, one says that the integers are closed under addition. Adding two integers produces another integer. It can never produce a fraction. But that does not mean that the set of integers is finite. Humanly thinkable thoughts are closed under the workings of our cognitive faculties and may of the solutions to the mysteries of philosophy, but the set of thinkable thoughts may be infinite nonetheless. Is this a pessimistic conclusion? Not at all. I find it exhilarating, a sign of great progress in our understanding of the mind. And it is my last opportunity to pursue the goal of this book, to get you to step outside your own mind for a moment and see your thoughts and feelings as magnificent contrivances of the natural world, rather than as the only way that things could be. First, if the mind is a system of organs designed by natural selection, why should we ever have expected it to comprehend all mysteries, to grasp all truths? We should be thankful problems of science are close enough in structure to the problems of our foraging ancestors that we have made the progress that we have. If there were nothing that were bad at understanding, we would have to question the scientific worldview that sees the mind as a product of nature. Cognitive closure should be true if we know what we are talking about. Still, one might have thought that the hypothesis was merely a daydream, a logical possibility that could go no further than late-night dorm room bull sessions. McGinn's attempt to identify the humanly unsolvable problems is an advance. Even better, we can glimpse why certain problems are beyond our ken. Even better, we can glimpse tutorial abilities. Our complicated ideas are built out of simpler ones. The meaning of the whole is determined by the meanings of the parts and the meanings of the relations that connect them. Part of a whole, example of a category, part of a whole, thing at a place, actor exerting force, cause of an effect, mind holding a belief. These logical and law-like connections provide the meanings of sentences in everyday speech and, through analogies and metaphors, lend their structures to the esoteric contents of science and math, where they are assembled into bigger and bigger theoretical edifices. We grasp matter as molecules, atoms, and quarks, matter as molecules, as DNA, genes, and a tree of organisms, change as position, momentum, and force, mathematics as symbols and operations. All are assemblies of elements composed according to laws, in which the properties of the whole are predictable from the properties of the parts and the way they are combined. Even when scientists grapple with seamless continua and dynamical processes, they couch their theories in words as computer simulations, combinatorial media that mesh with the workings of the mind. We are lucky that parts of the world behave as lawful interactions among simpler elements. But there is something peculiarly holistic and everywhere at once and nowhere at all and all at the same time about the problems of philosophy. Sentience is not a combination of brain events or computational states. How a red-sensitive neuron gives rise to the subjective feel of redness is not a whit less mysterious than how the whole brain gives rise to the entire stream of consciousness. The eye is not a combination of body parts or brain states or bits of information, but a unity or bits of information, but a unity is nowhere in particular. Free will is not a causal chain of events and states by definition, although the combinatorial aspect of meaning has been worked out, how words or ideas combine into the meanings of sentences or propositions, referring to something remains a puzzle, because it stands strangely apart from any causal connection between the thing referred to and the person referring. Knowledge, too, throws up the paradox that knowers are acquainted with things that have never impinged upon, Our thoroughgoing perplexity about the enigmas of consciousness, self, will, and knowledge may come from a mismatch between the very nature and the computational apparatus that natural selection has fitted us with. If these conjectures are correct, the most undeniable thing there is, our own awareness, would be forever beyond our conceptual grasp. But if our minds are part of nature, that is to be expected, even welcomed. The natural world evokes our awe by the specialized designs of its creatures and their parts. We don't poke fun at the eagle for its clumsiness on the ground, or fret that the eye is not very good ground, or fret because we know that a design can excel at one challenge only by compromising at others. Our bafflement at the mysteries of the ages may have been the price we paid for a combinatorial mind that opened up a world of words and sentences, of theories and equations, of poems and melodies, of jokes and stories, the very things that make a mind worth having. This is Grover Gardner for Audio Scholar. Thank you for listening.